Okay, so I am going to quickly walk you through homework chapter 11-3. It looks like a lot, and as long as you just take it step at a time and read the questions carefully, and especially pay attention to what they're actually asking for, it shouldn't be a problem. So we're talking about um, constrained resources, and constrained just means there's a limit. We only have so many hours or direct materials or whatever, and that's a limit. So that's what constrained means. Okay, Barlow Company manufactures three products, A, B, and C. The selling price, variable cost, and contribution margin for one unit of each product are as follows. And so they give me this information. Um, all the way down to the contribution margin ratio. So the same raw material is used in all three products. Barlow Company has only 6,300 pounds of raw material on hand. So I'm going to put that right here, 6,300 pounds available. So that's all I've got. That's my constrained resource. And will not be able to obtain any more of it for several weeks due to a strike in its supplier's plant. Management is trying to decide which products to concentrate on next week in filling its backlog of orders. The material cost is $9 per pound. So I'm going to put that right here, $9 per pound. So whenever a company is faced with a decision that they have a limited resource, they always focus on making all that the customers want of the most profitable product. And the best way to find out which one is most profitable is to figure out the contribution margin per pound. So usually we've been figuring out the contribution margin per unit, but we need to find out what is the contribution margin per pound. So the first thing we're going to do is figure out how many pounds does it take of the direct materials, because that's our constrained resource, to make one unit of A, one unit of B, and one unit of C. Now, that's not the answer they're looking for, but we have to figure this out first to figure out what the contribution margin per pound is for each product. And so, quite simply, we will just take the cost of the direct materials for A. If I can scroll up so you can see. So there's my A, direct materials, and I'm going to divide that by the cost per pound. And that answer will tell me that it takes 2 pounds to make one unit of A. And so then I'm going to actually anchor this cell so that then I can drag this formula across and do the same thing for B and the same thing for C. So B in mine is going to be 90 divided by 9, and C is 27 divided by 9. Those are how many pounds it takes to make each unit. Now we can figure out the contribution margin per pound, and that is going to be by taking the contribution margin per unit divided by the number of pounds per unit. And I'm going to drag that across because that will work. And so if you look, this one, contribution margin per unit divided by the pounds per unit. And then this one, contribution margin per unit divided by the pounds per unit. So that is the answer to requirement 1. Okay, requirement 2. Assuming that Barlow has unlimited demand for each of its three products. That means that there's no, oh, the customers only want 500 units or whatever. There's unlimited demand. They can sell as many as they can make. For each of its three products, what is the maximum contribution margin the company can earn when using its 6,300 pounds of raw materials on hand? So again, If we look at the contribution margin per pound, for my example, A has the highest contribution margin per pound. So if I have unlimited demand, then I am going to use all of that 6,300 pounds of material to make A, because that will make me the most money. So that's because that's what they're asking for, the maximum. So to do this, we need to take the pounds available times, whoops, nope, that should not be times, that should be divided by the pounds per unit. Gotta fix that. That's funny. Okay. And then I will take the units that I just figured out times the contribution margin per unit. And so that becomes the maximum contribution margin that the company can make if they use all of it to make the most profitable, which is A for mine. Double check your numbers because your number, I might have different numbers than you do, but the process is the same. Okay, assuming that Barlow's estimated, required 3. Assuming that Barlow's estimated customer demand is 600 units per product line, what is the maximum contribution margin the company can earn when using the 6,300 pounds of raw material on hand? Okay, so they just told me of every product they could sell 600 units, and I still have 6,300 pounds on hand. So right here, I'm just going to do some calculations because again, we're going to focus on making the most profitable first, which was A. I'm going to just put a little 1 right here. So we're going to do that one first. C is my next most profitable, so we're going to make that one second. And then whatever's left over is what we'll use to make B. Okay, so that's why I put A minus C, and then what's left over for B will be right there. Okay, so if I make 600 units of A, I need to multiply that by the pounds per unit, and that tells me I need 1,200 pounds to make 600 units of A. So right there, I'm subtracting 1,200 from my 6,300 that I had to begin with. So right now, before I make C, I would still have 5,100 units. I mean pounds, sorry. What did I do there? Oh, okay. So I'm making all 600 units of A. And so my contribution margin becomes 600 units times the contribution margin per unit. So 21,600. Now, my next most profitable is C. And if I'm going to make 600 units of C times the pounds per unit, which is 3, 1,800. So I had 1,800, I had 51,000. So there's my 1,800 and it gets subtracted. So when I get to it, 3,300 is what I have left over for B. So we were able to make all 600 units of C. And so I'm going to take 600 times contribution margin per unit equals the same as A. Didn't realize, oh, they have the same contribution margin per unit. Okay. So then B. First, I'm going to figure out how many units I can make of B because I have this many pounds of materials and I'm going to divide that by the pounds per unit. And I can only make 330 pounds, 330 units of B. Even though I could sell 600, I only have enough material left to make 330. And so I'm going to, let's see, so I'm going to equal this so that I don't get confused later to that, because that's what I have left over. And then I'm going to take 330 times the contribution margin per unit, and that equals 29,700. So then to get the maximum contribution margin, if I'm using my constrained resource wisely, it's going to be the contribution margin for A plus B plus C. And that's the answer to required 3. Okay, new thing. A foreign supplier could furnish Barlow with additional stocks of raw material at a substantial premium, which means higher price, over the usual price. Assuming Barlow's estimated customer demand is 600 units per product line, and that the company has used its 6,300 pounds of raw material in an optimal fashion, obviously we just figured that out, what is the highest price Barlow company should be willing to pay for additional pounds of material? And so basically, they just want to break even um, on the additional, 270 products of B. And so we're going to use B, and this is going to equal the contribution margin per pound for the least profitable, so it was 9, plus the cost per pound. And that is the highest price that they should be willing to pay per pound for extra material. Okay, so just me personally, I wanted to prove that this was right. And so the selling price per unit for B was 300. Whoops, sorry. The direct materials will be what did I do there? Oh, because I'm doing per unit. Oh, holy cow, that's not what I want. Ooh, boy. Okay, so it equals the highest price per pound times the pounds needed to make 1 unit. Because I'm just figuring this out for 1 unit. So my other variable expenses, go back up here. Other variable expenses for B, 120. And so my total variable expenses equals this plus this. So then my contribution margin is this minus this. And see, it comes out break even. So if I pay $18 a pound to make the rest of B to make 600 units, I will break even if I pay $18 a pound, or paying less would be great, but this is the highest price that they should be willing to pay, because at least they'll break even and they'll have happy customers because they fulfilled the orders. And again, I just did that to show why it's $18 and to prove that it was right. It's not a part of the problem in the book. Okay, question 2. All right. So I'm going to do some calculations here just at the beginning that are going to help me answer all of the, most of the requireds below, just because I like working right here while I have access to all of this. So one of the first things I want to figure out is the hours per unit. And I believe that that is actually what they're asking for in required 1, is the hours per unit. And so you look at all these numbers. What in the world do I do? So first, let's see, what are the words of the product? So we're making um, 5 products, and they named them people's names. And here's our demand for next year's units. That's going to be important later. Here's our selling price per unit, direct materials per unit, and direct labor per unit. And then they tell us the company's plan has a capacity of 92,190 direct labor hours. So I put that here because that is our constrained resource in this one. It's direct labor hours. And we pay $6 per hour for our direct labor. And fixed manufacturing costs total $600,000, and variable overhead is at $3 per direct labor hour. Okay, so those are all the company's non-manufacturing costs are fixed, and the company's finished goods inventory is negligible and can be ignored. So there's no beginning balance. Okay, so how do I figure out how many hours per unit it takes to make a unit of Debbie, Trish, Sarah, Mike, and a sewing kit? You quite simply take, let me make sure, I believe it's the direct labor hours divided by the cost per hour, right? Because they told us how much it costs per hour to make a unit of each one. And if I know I'm paying my employees $6 an hour, then I can take the direct labor cost per unit divided by the rate per hour that we're paying. So I'm paying, not paying these, and these are numbers. This is 0.35 of an hour. And I know decimals are weird when we're talking about minutes, but just trust me, it's going to be easier. And so I'm going to anchor this cell so that then I can drag this formula down, and it will then figure out exactly how many hours per unit of each product, right? So it's 0.48 divided by 6, 2.7 divided by 6, 3.9 divided by 6, and 0.78 divided by 6. That's what all of these are. Okay, so those are my answers to number 1. Equals Debbie equals Trish equals Sarah equals Mike equals. Okay, so that's direct labor hours per unit. That's what that is. Okay, so another thing I want to figure out is my variable overhead cost. And remember, this is $3 in my problem based on direct labor hours. And so for each one of these, I'm going to take the hours per unit times direct labor, or the variable overhead cost based on direct labor hours. And I'm going to anchor that cell. That way I can drag this down. And that tells me the variable overhead cost based on direct labor hours. Okay. So now I can figure out my contribution margin per unit. And that, remember, contribution margin is the selling price minus the variable expenses. So minus the direct materials, minus the direct labor, minus the variable overhead cost. And that will give me my contribution margin per unit. And that one, I don't need to anchor any cells. I can just drag that down, and that populates everything and tells me my contribution margin per unit for each one. And now I know one of the questions down below also asks for the contribution margin per hour. And so I'm going to take the contribution margin per unit and divide that by the hours per unit. And that gives me my contribution margin per hour. And this is going to be important because this will show us which one is most profitable by looking at the contribution margin per hour. Okay, so let's go down and see what we've answered. So question 2, how much variable overhead cost is incurred to manufacture 1 unit of each of the company's 5 products? So yes, we filled that in up here. Variable, wait, what was the question again? Variable overhead cost, right there. Hopefully I'm not driving any of you crazy, but this is just how I set it up. Okay, so that's the answer to 2. If you'll recall, that was the variable overhead cost per direct labor hour times the hours per unit that we figured out for the answer of required 1. Okay, so that's required 2. Round your answers. Okay, and do not round intermediate calculations. That's why I love using Excel, because even though this says 0.35, there's probably hidden numbers in the decimal because I didn't round it. And so it works really well. And then I can have it show just 2 decimals and then I can input it correctly. So what is the contribution margin per direct labor hour for each of the company's 5 products? So if you'll notice, we did that. It took us 2 steps, but we did it. It's the contribution margin per hour. And again, that is the contribution margin per unit divided by the hours per unit. And if you'll recall, we got this number by subtracting all of the variable costs from the selling price. The selling price per unit, direct materials, direct labor, and variable overhead costs. These numbers were given to us. This one we had to figure out. Okay, I'll finish putting those in down here. Equals contribution margin per direct labor for Trish and Sarah and Mike and the sewing kit. Okay, so if we notice, the sewing kit is the most profitable per hour. And then Debbie. And so that's why I've numbered these down here. And this is just where I'm going to do some calculations. And then Sarah, and then Trish, and then Mike is the least profitable. Okay, so required 4. Assuming that direct labor hours is the company's constraining resource, what is the highest total contribution margin that the company can earn if it makes optimal use of its constrained resource? So again, like I said on question 1, they're going to focus on making the most profitable and then down and down and down. And then the last one is just going to get what's left over of the direct labor hours we have available. Okay, so first thing, the units demanded was given to us very first. So the units demanded of Debbie is right there. And Trish, right there. Sarah, right there. And Mike, there. And the sewing kit, that's right. So that's how many our customers would like. But obviously we have a constrained resource of direct labor hours. And so it's just going to depend on how many hours it takes to make this many units of each one. So the hours needed for the unit demand, first we're going to focus on the sewing kit. I'm going to fill this all the way in. So this is going to equal the units times the answer to number 1. Okay, so that's how many hours I need to make 333,000 sewing kits. And so because we have, this is the first one we're focusing on, we can make all of them. And I'm not going to worry about that right now because we're not to Mike yet. So the contribution margin for that many units is going to equal the contribution margin per unit. I did something wrong. Hold on. Oh, you guys gotta help me out here. This is the units we're able to make. There we go. That's better. Okay, so we made all of the sewing kits and we still have hours left over. So let's figure out how many units, how many hours we need to make 58,000 units of Debbie. So answer to number 1. So we need 20,300 units. Yep, I put it over here. I still got time left, so I can make all of those units. And then my contribution margin is going to be the units times Debbie's contribution margin per unit. Okay, so we made Debbie. Now let's focus on Sarah. They want 43,000. And I times that by Sarah's direct labor hours per unit. So I need 27,950 hours. Oh, I still have hours left. And so we're able to make all of those units. And so we're going to do 43,000 times the contribution margin per unit for Sarah. Okay. Now we're to Trish. 50,000 units times Trish's direct labor hours per unit, 6,500. And we had enough. And so this is what's going to be left over for Mike. We'll get there in a minute. And so we're able to make all of these units. And so the contribution margin, let's see, for Trish is going to be 50,000 times Trish's contribution margin per unit. Okay. Now we're to Mike. So they want 48,000. Let's see. 48,000 times 0.45 for Mike equals 21,600. So we can't do that because we only have 10,800 available for Mike, right? Because we took our original 92,190 and subtracted all of the hours used to make the other products. That's all we have left over. So we can't make 48,000 units. But to figure out how many units we can make, we take the hours left over divided by the direct labor hours per unit. And that tells me I can make 24,000 units of Mike. And so I will take the 24,000 and times that by the contribution margin per unit for Mike. Okay, so then now I can finally get to the answer that they were asking for, which was the highest total contribution margin if they make optimal use of the constrained resource. And so that is going to equal Debbie plus Trish plus Sarah plus Mike plus the sewing kit. And that is my highest total contribution margin required for. Okay. Assuming the company has made optimal use of its 92,190 direct labor hours, what is the highest direct labor rate per hour that Walton Toy Company would be willing to pay for additional capacity? That is for added direct labor time. So basically overtime. What should they be willing to pay for overtime? So again, this is going to be, we're only looking at Mike because, right, that's the one we didn't make all of the units for. And so we're going to look at the product with the lowest contribution per direct labor hour. And then, so equals Mike's contribution margin per direct labor hour plus what the company pays per direct labor hour. So for mine, it was $6. So in my problem, the highest they should be willing to pay per direct labor hour is $15.22. And that's simply because then for those other 20,000 units, they'll at least break even. And so here's the proof for Mike. What's my selling price for Mike for 1 unit is $11. My direct materials for Mike for 1 unit. Okay, and then this will be the high direct labor rate per hour times the direct labor hours per unit. And then my variable overhead per unit for Mike was, oh, what was that? Right there, required 2. Okay, so my variable expenses, I'm going to add those 3 up, $11. So my contribution margin per unit equals the selling price of $11 minus variable expenses of $11, break even. So I know that that is the right answer. And again, you don't have to do this for the problem, but I did it so that I made sure I had the right answer because you want to break even at whatever that highest rate is. Hope that helps you all do well on this assignment.